Good morning, and welcome to this, the first of many press conferences that we will be holding throughout 2023, as we continue our mission to offer a real, credible alternative to a tired Westminster establishment. An establishment that has now been in power for far, far too long, and whose stranglehold over our politics and our people we must bring to an end together today. A particular welcome to the thousands of new members who have joined us over the last 2 months, believing as we do that now, more than ever, now is the time for something different. Britain is broken, and today we stand here ready to offer bold, brave solutions to the many problems that have been produced by those who still brazenly seek to convince you that they have the answers to the crises that they are responsible for creating. Ask yourself, compared to 10 years ago, do you feel better off? Do you feel safer? Do you feel our country is more secure? Is it better run? Do you feel more or less free? I suspect that your answer to those questions is the same as ours. And if indeed they are, then you owe it to yourselves to listen to what we have to say, to join with us in reminding everybody that the power to change those things rests where it always has, in the hands of the British people, and that together we need to use that power to bring about the change that we need. Chief amongst what we can offer is real leadership. Leadership that doesn't duck and cover when faced with hard choices, that doesn't hide behind headlines when it's time to stand and face the storm. Leadership that has the imagination, the compassion and the courage to make Britain great again. Ladies and gentlemen, our leader, Richard Tice.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everybody, and a very happy New Year to one and all. So here we are, beginning of the new year, and yes, it's Reform UK that is the first party with a press conference. Why? Because we're the party with momentum. We're polling about third equal, and we're gaining all the time, as Paul has just touched on. And you can tell just how worried the Tories are. The weekend, we had Lord Frost, no less, writing in a broadcast newspaper, writing that these are the reasons why you should not vote for reform. And all he could come up with was not about our policies. He was worried we didn't have enough party workers or infrastructure. So the Tories are worried, indeed so worried that the Prime Minister has rushed forward his own press conference to this afternoon so that he wouldn't be left behind again by Reform UK. And what's the Prime Minister's big plan? Well, unbelievable. He wants to give maths lessons. I'll be touching on that a bit later. But let's look at the prospects. A new year should be a time for new hope, new ambitions, new aspirations. It is, of course, a time when you think about what's our potential as an individual, as a family, as a community, and our potential as a country. And we should, of course, be a successful nation, lowly taxed, growing fast, a high-growth economy. We should have high-quality, prompt public services, giving great outcomes. We should have cheap energy. After all, we're sitting on trillions and trillions of pounds worth of our own energy treasure. We should have zero waiting lists, of course, with our healthcare system. We should have efficient government spending, no wasteful government spending, and of course, we should be smartly regulated, particularly post-Brexit. And all of these things are within our gift as a nation. But all of these things require leadership, bold, clear decision-making. No nonsense, no waffle, no spin. It's all doable. But what have we got instead? Well, we've had 12 years of government by various incarnations of what I call the con-socialists. Taxes, the highest for 70 years. Government spending, the highest for about 50 years. Inflation, the highest for 30 years plus. And productivity collapsing everywhere, the lowest for at least 30 years. And then there's the strikes. Who isn't striking at the moment in the public sector is probably the right question to ask. The strikes at levels we haven't seen since the 1970s. And I touched on energy. We've got so much treasure within the UK territory, and yet we've got the highest energy prices ever. That's literally making the nation and all of us poorer and colder. Just think about that. We've got our own energy that we all own as a nation, and yet we're poorer and colder because we're not using our own energy treasure. And then finally, NHS waiting lists, the highest ever. People have come to accept waiting lists as the norm. When I talk about zero waiting lists, people look at me as though I've walked off Mars, for heaven's sake. Seriously, most Western nations don't have waiting lists. The Prime Minister this afternoon is going to re-announce the ambition that you can see a GP within 14 days. I was recently in Australia and I talked about this supposed Tory ambition. They laughed at me. They said there'd be riots in Australia if you couldn't see a GP within a day. We have to lift our aspirations. We have to lift our ambitions. We can do this, but it requires leadership. It requires real reform. And you look at that list of what's going on in the UK today, and you can draw one simple conclusion. After 12 years, the Tories have broken Britain. They have literally wrecked our country. It's not their country, it's our country. And they've broken it. What works at the moment in broken Britain? Public services, the NHS, railways, Royal Mail, Border Force. What's really working? Immigration, completely out of control, as admitted by the Home Secretary. She admitted that they've lost control of our borders. Surely one of the most important things that a government can do is to maintain secure borders, to know who's coming in and who's going out. They kept saying that one of the Brexit advantages that many of us fought for so hard was to take control of our borders. But now the Tories have completely abandoned it. Nearly 46,000 illegal migrants coming across the Channel. Over 1.1 million additional people coming into the country on a gross basis in the year to June 2022. Law and order is completely collapsing up and down the country. And tragically, you see that in just completely random murders with guns, with knives in the festive season. The charging rate has literally slumped in the last few years to just 5.4%. That's charged, that's not convicted. So criminals know that the real likelihood is that they will get away with whatever crimes they are committing. Drugs gangs taking over our town centres and our cities, laundering their money, their vast profits. It's all completely and utterly out of control. And then we've got a record number of people on out-of-work benefits, some 5.2 million people. It's the highest ever. It's 1.5 million more than pre-COVID. And on top of that, there's another 2 million people on in-work benefits. That's essentially where businesses are being subsidised to keep pay at low levels, and they're being subsidised by the taxpayer. Where's the common sense in that. And yet, despite all of this, despite so many people who are trapped on benefits, big business, the multinational corporations and their lobbying group, the CBI, what do they want? Do they want to train our great young people? Do they want to get them into work? To help them, to motivate them? No, they want to abandon them and just import ever more cheap overseas labour. They don't want to train up, to skill up our own young people. It's a complete reckless abandonment of young British people. All of this, after 12 years of Tory rule. There's no question they have literally broken Britain. This graph here sets out the number of people on out-of-work benefits, actually since 9 years ago, 10 years ago, back in 2013. And you can see we're over 5 million people on out-of-work benefits. And yet we're told there's a labour shortage. And that's why big business wants to import ever more labour, cheap labour, from overseas. Surely the right thing to do is to help get our own people back into work. So who can fix broken Britain? Well, the Tories have been in charge for 12 years, and they have broken things. You know it's bad when people come up to me and say, Richard, I've got people who are literally resigning to go on benefits. You think something is fundamentally wrong. And the Tories have got literally no answers at all. But we're about to hear this afternoon from the Prime Minister, his big answer, his big solution to those challenges that I've laid out in broken Britain. What is his solution? More people should do maths until the age of 18. How many decades, Rishi, is that going to take to help people, to help our country? There's only one calculation that needs to be talked about, Rishi, and that is this. What is the answer when you've got a crisis, plus a crisis, plus a crisis? Let me tell you, we've got a national emergency. We've got a country that is broken. That is the answer to that calculation, Prime Minister, and you don't seem to have any solutions. You're going to talk about some plans for the NHS, but it's just a rehash of what we've heard before. We're the only party who's put forward bold, radical plans. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what solutions has the Labour Party got? Well, that's a very good question. I've asked people. The only thing they can think of is, wow, they want to put VAT on school fees in order to close a bunch of independent schools. That's not going to deal with any of the crises in broken Britain that I've just mentioned. So Labour have got no solutions, but Reform UK have. We're the only party that knows that we've got to make Britain great. But to do that, you've got to make Britain work. And in order to make Britain work, we've got to make work pay. Surely that is logical. And what's happened is that the tax levels at the moment mean that for far too many, actually working isn't paying. And that's why I say you've got people literally coming up to me and saying, why are people resigning to go on benefits? 1 in 8 of the working age population today are on out-of-work benefits. The two main parties don't want to talk about this. There's no discussion, no debate whatsoever. It's a complete abandonment of some of those in the greatest need in our country. Low pay and high tax means that too many people who want to work are actually being trapped in a spiral of being on benefits. And that is an absolute tragedy. Now, as we've grown in the polls and we've got momentum, more and more people, the media, are starting to pay attention. But our key economic policy has been the same since day one, since we launched Reform UK, and that is, in order to make work pay, we've got to dramatically change the threshold, the starting point at which people start paying income tax. Now, the average salary is around about £30,000 a year, and yet people are paying income tax from £12,500. And the Chancellor seems to think it's a good idea to freeze that threshold level out into the ether until 27, 28, that sort of time. I say no. We've got to make work pay. And that means you lift the starting point from £12,500 to £20,000. That's still about 2/3 of the average salary. And let's remember, when income tax was introduced, by the way, as a temporary tax, hundreds of years ago, it was supposed to be a tax on the rich. But it's now become a tax that hits the least well off, the lowest paid, the poorest, the most. If we do that, if we lift the threshold, the starting point, from 12.5 grand to 20 grand, that frees up 6 million people from paying any income tax whatsoever. That's about 30 quid a week. For people on low incomes, that is a significant difference. £1,500 a year. All of a sudden, the scales drop from people's eyes, and you can say, yes, I can see how you make work pay. And then you see what happens, the attraction to get people off benefits. Now, the cost of this, of course there's a cost to it. On a net basis, it's around about 40 billion a year. But no one's talking about the fact that it's much less inflationary if you lift the threshold at which people start paying income tax than the current debate, which is all about how much to increase the gross salaries. So, for example, an average nurse, if you lift the income tax threshold to 20 grand, that's about a 6% net take-home increase for the average nurse. 6%. Now, the nurses are asking for 19%. So you can suddenly see that actually you're making a real significant difference, and that it's much less inflationary to lift the starting point for paying income tax than it is to increase gross salaries. And that's why on our healthcare plan that we announced back in December, we're saying that all of the frontline health and social care workers, all of them, should pay 0 basic rate income tax for the next 3 years. Just think about that. And I set out how to pay for it. That would help retain staff, it would help solve the current strikes, and it would help bring staff back into our healthcare and social care. We all know the problems in the healthcare system. We're the only people with a big, bold, radical solution. And if we lift the income tax threshold to 20 grand, all of a sudden, for those on low pay, for those on benefits, it pays to go to work. And we have to have a proper debate and to come up with real ways to motivate, to train, to enthuse. I say, let's set a target. Let's get 2 million people who are currently on out-of-work benefits into full-time work. We know there's a labour shortage. So let's use our own great people rather than import people from overseas. Let's train them. Let's enthuse them. That surely is the right thing to do. It's an absolute tragedy of wasted talent for the individuals themselves. The extra dignity, feeling of self-worth, achievement, earning to put food on the table, to pay one's own bills, is huge for them, their families, their children, their communities, and therefore, of course, for the country. And if you've got 2 million people off out-of-work benefits back into work, then there's a massive, massive saving on our benefits bill. It's in the order of 30 to 40 billion a year. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but with determination, with the right focus, with the right effort, with the right motivation, we could achieve that. Let's be ambitious and say we achieve that on a 2-year time frame. So you can see that if we make work pay, all of a sudden we go a huge way towards helping resolving the current cost of living crisis, why so many people are thinking about striking or being forced to strike. We can get people back into work, which is good for them, for their own health, their own families, and good for the country. And if you look at our economic plan, the other thing that there's no talk about is the need to save on wasteful government spending. And that's why the balance of the cost of our plan can easily be met by savings from cutting government waste. I've said it before, I'll say it again. All of us are looking at our budgets and saying, right, where can we save £5 in 100 because of the cost of energy, the cost of living crisis? We're all doing that. Businesses are doing that. So my challenge to the government, every single spending department, every quango, every local authority, every manager that spends our taxpayers' cash, you've got to save £5 in 100 as well. We're all doing it at home. Businesses are doing it. So the government, when spending our cash, needs to do exactly the same. You've got to save £5 in 100, and you can't cut any frontline services. It's all doable. We all see waste every single day of the week. It's there to be cut. It's there to be done. But once again, it requires leadership. It requires determination. It requires focus. And we see none of that, not even a debate about it, from this government. I've touched on our health and social care plan that we announced back in December. And the way to pay for that health and social care plan, of course, is the Bank of England. And I'll repeat this because it's not an easy concept, but currently the Bank of England is paying interest to the commercial banks on the money that the Bank of England printed. Imagine, I print 20 quid on my home printer, and I give that 20 quid to you. That's literally what the Bank of England did. They printed the money, they've given it to people. Why would I pay interest on the money that I've printed on my home printer and given to you? It's madness. Other central banks are not doing it. Our central bank should not doing it. A former Deputy Bank of England governor agrees we shouldn't be doing it. Senior economists agree we shouldn't be doing it. And yet this Bank of England and this Chancellor think it's a good idea to do that. The cost to us, depending on the rate of interest, is somewhere between 20 and 40 billion pounds a year of our cash, our taxpayers' money, that this government, this governor of the Bank of England, think is a good idea to pay to rich city institutions. It's completely and utterly wrong. And if they didn't do that, you could enact the health and social care plan that we, Reform UK, have put forward. And the second key plan that we've put forward just in the last months of 2022 was, of course, the plan to deal with the illegal migrant crisis across the Channel. We've got a clear 6-point plan based on the system that worked in Australia. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Use something that's worked elsewhere, the track record of success. And in the appendices to my presentation, we set that out. So what I would say to you, in summary, is that the United Kingdom should be a great, great nation. We've got so much potential, so much opportunity. We can truly make Britain great. But at the moment, that's being wasted. Why? Because this government have utterly failed. They've broken Britain. The opposition have got no ideas, no bold solutions. We, Reform UK, we know how to make Britain great. To do that, we've got to make Britain work. And to make Britain work, you've got to make work pay. Thank you very much indeed.